A white passenger whipped a black baby with a seatbelt. Seconds later, the father turned the same belt into a weapon of justice. He thought a crying child deserved punishment, not comfort. He didn't know justice was watching from the next seat. Subscribe if you believe every act of cruelty deserves its reckoning. The first cry pierced the cabin just as the final overhead bin clicked shut. A sharp, high-pitched wail that broke through the soft drone of the aircraft settling into its evening routine. Heads turned, brows lifted, but most passengers returned to their phones or books. Row 2A, first class, an aisle seat just left of the galley, was the source. An infant, not yet 1 year old, his tiny fists balled against the sides of his cheeks, was twisting uncomfortably in his carrier. His father, Isaiah Trent, leaned in quickly, whispering words only the baby could hear. "It's okay, Caleb." "We're almost there," Isaiah murmured, bouncing slightly, cradling the boy's head with practiced care. Across the aisle, a loud, deliberate sigh broke the rhythm. Cliff Mercer, pressed into his own first-class seat with stiff posture and folded arms, turned his head slowly toward them. His jaw twitched. His expensive shoes tapped once against the floor, the sound crisp and irritable. "Some of us paid for peace," he muttered, not loud enough to be confrontational but clear enough to be heard. Isaiah kept his eyes on his son. It wasn't the first time he'd heard something like that. Not in boardrooms, not in airport lounges, and certainly not when traveling as a solo father with a black child. He adjusted Caleb's pacifier, hoping the pressure on the baby's gums would offer some comfort. The lights in the cabin dimmed slightly as the flight attendants completed their final checks. The plane began its slow taxi. "Sir, you're okay?" asked a male flight attendant, Gavin Lorne, pausing by Isaiah's seat, a warm smile on his face. Isaiah nodded. "Yeah, he's just teething." "It should pass." Gavin's smile softened, his eyes flicking briefly toward Cliff before he moved on. "Let us know if you need anything, Mr. Trent." The cabin vibrated as the plane gathered speed, then lifted, nose first into the darkening sky. As the lights of the airport fell away beneath them, so too did any illusions Isaiah had about this being a quiet flight. Caleb whimpered again. Cliff shifted in his seat, rubbing his temple like the noise caused him actual pain. By the time the plane leveled out above the clouds, Cliff had already summoned an attendant twice, once for noise-canceling headphones, once to complain about the unsettling disturbance. Neither request was about comfort. They were warnings. Isaiah focused on his son. He rocked him gently, placing a small blanket across Caleb's chest, rubbing slow circles into his back. His laptop lay unopened in the seat pocket. The presentation slides for his software demo in Valenport would have to wait. "Do you even know how to settle a baby?" Cliff snapped suddenly, his voice rising like a hook slicing through the air. Isaiah's head turned, slow and measured. His expression didn't change, but his voice carried weight. "He's a baby. He's teething. That's not something you mute with a switch." Cliff leaned back with a tight scoff. "Discipline works. But I guess that's out of fashion for some people." Gavin returned at once, stepping between the seats, hands slightly raised. "Sir, I'll ask that we keep this calm. It's a long flight and everyone deserves to arrive in peace." "Then move him and his noise to the back," Cliff said, jerking his chin toward Isaiah. "Some of us have standards." Isaiah exhaled slowly, pressing his forehead briefly to Caleb's. The child had settled for now, the pacifier finally accepted. The silence should have been a relief, but Isaiah's gut told him it was the kind of silence that didn't last. "You're welcome to offer him your seat if it makes you feel better," Isaiah said coolly. Cliff laughed, a short, biting sound. "I'm not here to be funny. I'm here to rest, but I can tell your kind doesn't really know when to stop pushing." The sentence didn't need clarification. Gavin stiffened but remained professional. "Sir," he said firmly, "any further remarks like that, and we'll be filing a report with cabin security." Cliff raised both hands in faux innocence. "Just saying what everyone's thinking." Isaiah's fingers curled slightly at his sides, then released. He had learned not to meet fire with fire, not here, not with Caleb in his arms, but he also wasn't the man to shrink away. A few rows behind, a young male passenger, Evan Drake, watched without speaking. He had been quiet the entire boarding process, headphones idle around his neck. He studied Cliff's face. It wasn't just annoyance, it was something colder. There was a weight behind Cliff's glances that didn't belong to mere frustration. Something rehearsed. Isaiah returned to his seat, slowly lowering Caleb into the carrier beside him. His mind raced, not with fear, but with calculation. There was nothing random about Cliff's words, and though the cabin had quieted once again, the feeling in the air had shifted. Not tension, not yet, but pressure. Cliff unbuckled his seatbelt with an audible click, stretching as though bored, but his hand lingered too long on the strap. His thumb brushed the metal clasp, turning it slightly as though memorizing its weight. He didn't look at Isaiah. He just smiled faintly and pulled the belt loose with a snap. Isaiah didn't react, but something in his eyes darkened. He reached for his son again. Outside, clouds slid past the windows like slow waves. Inside, beneath the overhead lights and quiet whispers of air circulation, a confrontation was quietly gathering its shape, unspoken but inevitable. He had no idea that the journey ahead would shatter more than peace. It would test the meaning of fatherhood itself. "Can you shut that noise already?" The words pierced through the low thrum of the cabin like a blade through cloth. Cliff Mercer's voice was sharp, cold, and unfiltered, loud enough to turn at least 6 heads nearby. His face twisted with impatience as he leaned forward in his seat, eyes burning into Isaiah Trent with open disdain. The belt sign above flickered in silent warning overhead, but Cliff didn't glance at it. His focus was solely on the crying baby across the aisle. Isaiah looked up slowly. He had been gently bouncing Caleb, his infant son, in the crook of his arm, whispering comfort into the child's ear, swaying in rhythm with the motion of the plane. The cries had come in waves, high-pitched but helpless, the sound of a baby in distress rather than defiance. Teething pain, Isaiah knew. The kind of hurt even a soft lullaby or a father's embrace couldn't quite soothe. "I'm doing everything I can," Isaiah said calmly, his voice low and even. "He's teething." "It'll pass." But calm only fanned the flame in Cliff's chest. He scoffed, leaning back in his seat with a loud, theatrical sigh. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. "First class used to mean something." Gavin Lorne, the flight attendant in his late 30s with a clipped beard and tired eyes, moved swiftly up the aisle. His hands were clasped in front of him with practiced diplomacy. "Sir," Gavin began, addressing Cliff, "I can see you're frustrated. I might be able to find you a more isolated seat toward the back if you'd prefer." "Why should I move?" Cliff cut in, his voice rising again. "He's the one who brought a howling kid into first class. He should be in the back, where noise belongs." Isaiah's fingers tightened subtly around Caleb's back. His instincts screamed to protect, but he kept his expression composed, eyes never leaving Cliff's. Around them, passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Some whispered. Some reached for phones, just in case. A few rows behind, a thin young man with glasses, Evan Drake, sat motionless, observing. He hadn't said a word the entire flight, but now his eyes narrowed, tracing the contours of Cliff's flushed face, his tightened jaw, the way his hand lingered near his belt buckle, not with boredom, but with thought. "Sir," Gavin tried again, his tone firmer this time, "we want everyone to have a safe and respectful experience on board. I'll ask you to lower your voice." Cliff ignored him. "I paid to sit here. I didn't pay to be screamed at by some kid and preached to buy." He stopped short, but the pause said more than a slur might have. The implication hung in the air, thick and unmistakable. Isaiah said nothing. Instead, he turned his body slightly, shielding Caleb more fully with his frame. The child had quieted some, now fussing softly against his father's shoulder, thumb nudging his lips. Isaiah's heart pounded, less from fear and more from restraint. This wasn't the first time he'd felt this particular kind of pressure, the weight of being watched, the expectation to stay composed when every muscle wanted to react. "Keep rocking him," Isaiah whispered to himself more than Caleb. "Keep breathing. Keep steady." The plane gently shifted into cruising altitude, the engines humming steadily. Cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a cooler glow on everything. And that's when Cliff made his next move, not with words this time, but with something far more deliberate. He unbuckled his seatbelt. There was no reason to. No one else was standing, no food service had started. But the way his fingers traced the strap before releasing it was slow. Too slow. The buckle clicked free with a muted snap, and he left it hanging, his hand brushing along the length of it like one might test the weight of a rope. Evan Drake saw it. Gavin saw it. But neither moved just yet. "Sir, please remain seated until—" Gavin began again, but Cliff simply reclined and stretched his arms over his head, feigning nonchalance. "I'm just getting comfortable," Cliff muttered, then flashed a crooked smile in Isaiah's direction. "But some people make that impossible, don't they?" Isaiah glanced at the belt now dangling off the side of Cliff's seat. He said nothing, but a muscle ticked in his jaw. He rocked Caleb gently again, pressing a kiss to his forehead. The crying had returned in a soft wail, the kind that trembled and echoed, that cut through metal and air. Cliff shifted again, deliberately brushing his shoe across the aisle, just barely grazing Isaiah's foot. The contact was minor, but intentional, a taunt disguised as clumsiness. "Let it go," Isaiah whispered under his breath. "Let it go." But letting go was getting harder. From the corner of his eye, Isaiah noticed Gavin tap something on his earpiece, likely alerting the cockpit of a potential escalation. The air inside the cabin had shifted entirely, no longer the calm hum of routine travel. It was tense now, charged like a wire about to spark. The smiles were gone. Even the baby's cries seemed to blend with the low drone of unease. Back in row 3, Evan finally set his phone to record. Cliff reached again for the belt, his fingers curling around the strap as if by accident. He tugged on it slightly, testing the weight. Foreshadowing, thick and unspoken, danced between every motion. And yet, Isaiah stayed still, because he knew something Cliff didn't, something that came not from force, but from experience. From every room he'd walked into where he had to prove himself, from every injustice endured in silence, from every moment he chose calm over chaos not out of fear, but out of love, especially now, for the child in his arms. Peace is fragile when hate waits quietly beside it. The seatbelt snapped through the air with a sharp hiss. Isaiah saw the motion too late. Cliff's hand was a blur, his grip tight on the strap he'd yanked from his own seat, and before Gavin could reach them, the metal buckle slashed forward. It struck Isaiah across the forearm with a loud crack, leather and steel meeting skin. The sound echoed louder than the engine's hum for that moment, turning heads in every direction. A gasp rippled through the cabin. Isaiah stumbled back a step, his body instinctively curling around Caleb, whose startled cries rose to a new pitch. The infant's blanket had shifted, exposing his tiny shoulder, but Isaiah's arm had taken the blow meant to land lower. Pain bloomed instantly along his wrist, a red welt already forming. Yet he didn't cry out. He didn't curse. He didn't flinch. Cliff stood frozen, chest heaving, eyes wide with something between rage and satisfaction. "Maybe now you'll learn," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper but sharp enough to cut through the stunned silence. Gavin finally wedged himself between them, one arm outstretched, the other held up as if defusing a bomb. "Sir, sit down now." His voice carried the weight of urgent command. "This is a federal offense." Step back, Cliff didn't move. His fingers twitched around the slack of the seatbelt still clutched in his hand, and for a split second, It looked like he might strike again. His jaw clenched. His eyes darted around the cabin, registering the dozen or more phones now pointed in his direction. Passengers sat frozen, some whispering, some filming, some too shocked to react. Isaiah didn't move either. He stood with Caleb tight against his chest, his breathing controlled but deliberate, his eyes locked on Cliff. Not in anger, not even in fear, but in something deeper, restraint sharpened by purpose. His pulse pounded in his ears, but his hands were steady. He didn't speak. Cliff took a step forward anyway. "I'm not the one causing trouble," Cliff said, louder now, performing for the audience. "He's the one disturbing the whole cabin with that noise." His voice was tight, pitched with justification, but beneath the surface it wavered with something nervous. "This is first class, not daycare." Gavin turned to him, sterner now. "Sir, you assaulted a passenger, and a child was nearly struck. You need to return to your seat immediately." But Cliff's grip on the seatbelt didn't loosen. He wasn't hearing Gavin anymore. He was watching Isaiah, the quiet man who hadn't fought back, who hadn't raised his voice, who simply stood firm with his child wrapped in the shield of his arms. The flight had started only 90 minutes ago, but this moment felt suspended in air, stretched like thin wire across the aisle between two men. Passengers sat silent. The baby's cries faded into whimpers, muffled against Isaiah's shoulder. "Go ahead," Cliff sneered suddenly. "Play the victim. That's what you people do best." The words hit harder than the belt. Gavin's jaw tightened. A murmur surged from the passengers nearby, a collective recoil from the line that had been crossed. One man toward the back leaned into the aisle as if ready to stand. Isaiah's fingers tensed slightly against Caleb's back, but he said nothing. His eyes never left Cliff. His feet never moved. His silence deepened. Cliff was breathing harder now, cornered by his own pride, by the cameras, by the authority standing between him and the man he'd just struck. He looked around, expecting support, finding none. The cabin had turned against him. Even those who earlier sighed at the baby now looked away, ashamed. From the cockpit curtain, another male attendant peered in, alerted by the chaos. Gavin signaled him silently. Cliff's shoulders sagged just slightly, but his knuckles were still white around the belt. "I'm not the bad guy here," he muttered. "I'm not." Isaiah's eyes narrowed just a fraction. He could feel the sting in his arm throbbing. He could feel Caleb's small hand grasping his shirt. He could feel the weight of every phone camera recording his reaction. And still, he chose quiet. Gavin placed a firm hand on Cliff's elbow. "You need to return to your seat right now, sir." Cliff resisted for a moment longer, then dropped the belt with a clatter onto his seat and turned away, his movements jerky. He slumped into his chair, muttering under his breath. His face was red now, not just from rage, but from the humiliation of being witnessed. Isaiah slowly sat down, cradling Caleb. His heart pounded, but his breathing slowed as he focused on the boy in his arms. His thumb gently brushed the infant's cheek. Caleb blinked, hiccuped, and finally nestled in, exhausted from the chaos. The red mark on Isaiah's arm deepened. Across the aisle, Cliff stared forward, refusing to look at anyone. Gavin stood for a moment longer before backing away, nodding subtly to his colleague who now hovered near the galley phone, likely alerting the captain. The plane continued to fly, high and level, but the atmosphere was anything but calm. Conversations resumed in low tones, phones still rolling, passengers glancing between Isaiah and Cliff like something dangerous might still unfold. But Isaiah didn't look around. He didn't demand justice. He didn't yell. He held his son. And in that quiet, something louder than fury filled the cabin. Sometimes, silence becomes the cruelest witness of all. The seatbelt lashed through the air again. A sharp crack cut across the tense cabin as Cliff Mercer's second strike tore through the space, grazing the edge of baby Caleb's blanket. It didn't touch the child, but it came terrifyingly close. Gasps echoed around the first-class section. A woman near the bulkhead covered her mouth while a man in row 3 instinctively ducked his head as if he could shield the baby from where he sat. Cameras were already up, phones trembling in passengers' hands, screens glowing in the dim cabin light, capturing the moment in jittery frames and distorted audio. Isaiah Trent's arms had been up, shielding his child, but now he moved. With a fluid, purposeful motion, he handed Caleb, still fussing softly but now wide-eyed and confused, to the passenger beside him. The man, middle-aged and bearded, looked startled but accepted the child instinctively, holding him close as Isaiah stood. The calm that had defined Isaiah until now peeled away, replaced by something deeper. Not anger, not panic, something solid, something centered. Cliff's chest heaved across the aisle. "People like you don't belong here," he shouted, spit catching at the corners of his mouth. His voice rang with a fury that made even the flight attendants hesitate. The sentence dropped like a lead weight in the air, charged, ugly, unmistakable. Gavin Lorne, the lead attendant on duty, stepped between the two men, hands outstretched in a desperate attempt to defuse. "Sir, please sit down," he said to Cliff, his voice trying to command authority. "You need to calm down right now. This is not—" Cliff didn't hear him, or didn't care. His eyes were locked on Isaiah. His hand tightened around the seatbelt strap, ready to swing again. "Back up," Gavin warned, sterner now, but he was too slow. The belt came forward again in a whipping arc. This time, Isaiah caught it. His arm snapped up like a spring. The leather strap stopped mid-swing, caught between Isaiah's fingers with a suddenness that silenced even the cries in the rear of the cabin. The metal buckle clinked lightly against his wrist as he closed his grip around the belt, absorbing the momentum with shocking control. Cliff's eyes widened, not in fear, not yet, but in disbelief, like a man whose assumptions about the world had just been rewritten in real time. There was no growl, no barked response, no vengeance in Isaiah's face, just quiet power. Isaiah took a single step forward, his shoes grounded solidly into the aisle carpet. Cliff instinctively retreated one step, bumping into the armrest behind him, the edge digging into his thigh. He looked down at the belt, still in Isaiah's grasp, as if only now realizing that his weapon no longer belonged to him. The cabin fell under a strange hush. Even the low drone of the engine seemed to fade as attention narrowed to the space between these two men, one boiling over with hate, the other embodying a restraint that had turned unshakable. Gavin stood frozen between them, his eyes flicking from one man to the other. "Sir," he said again, quieter this time, unsure who he was even addressing now. Isaiah's fingers opened, and the belt dropped to the floor in front of Cliff's shoes. "Enough," Isaiah said, the word soft but thunderous in its finality. Cliff's breath came in ragged bursts, his hands still curled like claws by his sides. But he didn't move. His face twisted, somewhere between rage and shame, neither winning. Isaiah's chest rose and fell slowly, each breath steady and paced. Behind him, Caleb let out a faint whimper, sensing the weight in the air even in his young confusion. The man holding him, now visibly shaking, reached over to return the child, his arm brushing Isaiah's as he whispered, "He's okay." Isaiah took his son back gently, holding him to his chest. The baby clung to his shirt, burying his face in his father's collarbone, seeking the heartbeat he trusted. One of the other passengers, Evan Drake, a wiry man in his 20s, rose halfway out of his seat, his phone still filming but now lowered slightly. His voice broke the tension first. "He swung first," he said aloud, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "We all saw it." A murmur of agreement spread like wind catching fire. Others nodded, voices chiming in, some with words, others with expressions of disbelief, solidarity, or quiet outrage. Gavin moved quickly then, finally regaining his footing in the moment. "We're securing the cabin," he announced, speaking into his radio. Assault on board. "We need ground response ready at Valenport." Isaiah said nothing. He kept his eyes on Cliff, but the confrontation was over. Not with fists, not with fury, but with presence. Cliff, now visibly trembling, lowered himself into his seat without a word. Isaiah adjusted Caleb's blanket, pressing a soft kiss to the top of his head. Around him, the air began to move again. Passengers breathed. Lights flickered back into focus. The world resumed its spin, but nothing felt quite the same. And as Gavin began ushering other attendants into coordinated action, and as the cabin reoriented itself around the shock it had just endured, Isaiah remained still, his gaze steady, his silence speaking volumes. He had endured enough. Now he would redefine what endurance meant. Cliff lunged. The belt in his hand sliced through the narrow space between seats with a whip crack sound. His face twisted into something no longer human, something primal and spiteful. The metal buckle flashed beneath the cabin lights like a blade drawn in fury. His voice followed, coarse and full of hatred, spitting, "You don't get to act like you belong here." Isaiah didn't flinch. His body moved before thought caught up, instinct honed by years of navigating rooms that judged him before he spoke. He stepped sideways, shielding the aisle from Caleb, whose startled cry rang sharp and high. Cliff was mid-swing, off balance in his rage. In that instant, Isaiah's hand shot out, not to strike, but to redirect. He caught the belt just past the buckle and, with one fluid motion, yanked it free from Cliff's grip. The cabin gasped again. The sound came from everywhere, mouths covered, hands trembling, phones rising. But Isaiah didn't hear them. He saw only the hate in Cliff's eyes, the trembling chest, the shaking knuckles that had moments ago come within inches of harming his son. Isaiah's heart thundered, not from fear, but from a steady, anchored resolve. He moved with precision, his motions deliberate, every second stretching like pulled wire. With the belt coiled in his hand, Isaiah reached out and looped it around Cliff's lower jaw, tucking it just under the hinge like a craftsman applying a clamp. Cliff tried to jerk away, but Isaiah held firm, his grip unyielding, not fueled by rage but by conviction. Cliff's legs buckled slightly under the pressure. The belt tightened, not to choke, not to injure, but to stop. Isaiah's voice broke the silence, low and steady, cold like the sky beyond the airplane window. "That's how control feels." His words cut deeper than any punch. The buckle pressed into Cliff's cheekbone, leaving a flush-red imprint against his pale skin. The older man's face contorted, first in shock, then in pain, and finally in something unfamiliar, humiliation. He stopped struggling, breathing heavily through his nose, eyes darting around the cabin as if only now realizing the world had been watching. Behind them, a boy no older than 16 held his phone still and steady, filming everything. Across the aisle, another passenger whispered, "He had a baby in his arms, for God's sake." Then came the crew. Gavin, face tight with urgency, wedged himself between the men. "Let go, sir," he said to Isaiah, hands raised in de-escalation but voice trembling with something that wasn't fear, it was awe. Two more attendants followed, one securing the stunned Cliff by the shoulders and the other gently guiding Isaiah's arms away. Isaiah released the belt without resistance. Cliff stumbled back into his seat, clutching his jaw, wheezing softly like the wind had been knocked from his entire body. His eyes darted to the surrounding passengers, men who glared back, unblinking. No allies, no sanctuary. Gavin stepped between them, speaking into his earpiece urgently. Cabin conflict contained. Requesting medical standby on arrival. Suspect restrained by passenger. No further threat at this time, but the tension didn't vanish. It hung in the air like static after lightning, humming and thick. A child near the back sobbed quietly. The engines droned on, indifferent. Isaiah, breathing evenly now, turned and reclaimed his son from the man who had guarded Caleb during the standoff, a gray-haired gentleman who had simply nodded and said, "He's okay. when Isaiah reached out. Caleb whimpered as Isaiah held him, burying his face in his father's neck. Isaiah whispered into his ear, gentle, soothing, rhythmic hums, not words. It wasn't for Caleb alone. It was for himself, too. He needed the rhythm to calm the storm in his chest. Cliff didn't speak again. His mouth was slightly open, his breathing shallow, shoulders rigid with shame. But the damage was done, and not in the way he thought. Around them, multiple phones remained raised, quietly recording or already uploading. The digital world was faster than gravity. Within minutes, before the landing gear had even begun its descent, hashtags were appearing. Flight 419, Isaiah Trent, Seatbelt Assault. The story was no longer confined to a single plane. It was already stretching its wings beyond the clouds. Isaiah didn't know yet how far it would fly, but he felt something shift, not just in the cabin, but inside himself. A line had been crossed, not just by Cliff, but by the world that had allowed men like Cliff to believe their hatred had no cost. As the flight attendants resumed their positions, eyes darting nervously between their notes and their passengers, Gavin leaned toward Isaiah. "I'm sorry this happened." "We'll report it. Everything," he said softly, barely above the hum of the air vents. Isaiah nodded once, his expression unreadable. His attention never left Cliff, not out of fear, but vigilance. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he felt the cold burn of something greater rising. Not revenge, not even justice, exposure. Unbeknownst to both, cameras had captured every second, from the provocation to the restraint, and by the time the plane landed, the footage would already be racing across social media. Justice was about to find its wings in the most unexpected sky. The wheels hit the tarmac with a screech, but the tension inside Flight 419 hadn't landed with the aircraft. It hovered in the cabin like smoke, thick and breathless. Eyes darted, chests rose and fell with nervous rhythm, and whispers slid between rows like wind through a broken window. No one moved, not even Cliff. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, the overhead lights flickered to full brightness, illuminating the faces of passengers still frozen by what they'd just witnessed. Isaiah sat upright. Caleb nestled against his chest, tiny fingers gripping the collar of his shirt. The boy had stopped crying, sensing the strange energy around them, his breath soft against his father's skin. Isaiah's arm still throbbed where the buckle had struck, now an angry welt wrapped like a red ring around his wrist. But he kept his posture straight, eyes forward, jaw set. Not a single word escaped him. His silence spoke louder than outrage ever could. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, for your safety, please remain seated as security personnel will be boarding the aircraft shortly," the captain announced, voice calm but strained. Heads turned. Cliff, still clutching the side of his face where the belt had pressed into bone, scoffed and straightened in his seat. He glanced at Isaiah, who didn't flinch, didn't blink. Something inside Cliff snapped again. As soon as the seatbelt signs dimmed, the main cabin door swung open and a pair of uniformed men stepped inside. Leading them was Damon Keir, head of airport ground security, tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes that didn't waste time. He scanned the scene once, noting the crowd of nervous passengers, the awkward spacing around the two men in question, and the heavy silence that followed them like a shadow. Before anyone else could speak, Cliff pointed across the aisle with trembling fury. "He attacked me," he spat. "He wrapped that belt around my face. You need to arrest him right now." Gasps stirred again, one from the flight attendant near the galley, another from a teen passenger filming discreetly from his phone. Damon's face remained unreadable. "Is that so?" he said, walking forward slowly, his boots echoing dully on the cabin floor. "Anyone else see what happened?" For a heartbeat, there was stillness. Then a man near the back raised his phone and stood. "I recorded everything," he said, voice calm but firm. And so did others. Like a rising wave, more passengers stood or lifted their phones in the air. One by one, they offered silent testimony in pixels and footage, truth recorded from multiple angles. Damon motioned for the first man to approach and handed his subordinate a small tablet to begin reviewing clips. Cliff's face began to pale. "They're lying," he snapped. "That footage is taken out of context. He could have hurt my eye. Look at this bruise." But Damon didn't look at the bruise. He was watching the video. It took less than 30 seconds for him to see the swing, the belt cutting through air, aimed at Isaiah. He replayed the slow-motion swipe across Caleb's blanket, saw Isaiah block it, then disarm it with control, not rage. The final frame froze with Cliff's jaw bound in a loop of restraint, not violence. Damon lifted his head slowly. "Mr. Mercer," he said, voice low and even, "I'm going to need you to stand up and place your hands where I can see them." "What? You've got to be kidding. He's the one who—" "I saw the footage. So did half this cabin," Damon interrupted. "And unless you want to add resisting arrest to the list, I suggest you cooperate." Cliff's mouth opened, but the words stuck like thorns in his throat. His eyes scanned the rows of strangers, each one a quiet witness, each one remembering. Slowly, reluctantly, he rose. Damon reached for his cuffs, motioning to his partner to secure the other side. As the metal clicked around his wrists, Cliff leaned forward, his voice dropping to a bitter whisper. "You'll regret this," he said, eyes locked on Isaiah. Isaiah didn't move. His only answer was the soft pat of Caleb's breath against his neck. Outside, the airport terminal pulsed with media. Somehow, word had traveled faster than the flight itself. Reporters pressed against the glass walls, camera flashes blooming like fireflies in a storm. Microphones were already being raised, though no one yet knew the full story. But they would. Every video, every cry, every second was about to be dissected across the world. As Cliff was led down the aisle, muttering under his breath, Isaiah remained seated. Damon gave him a long glance, measuring, perhaps, or quietly grateful that the man who could have struck back chose control instead. Isaiah gave a small nod, not for approval, but for closure. He stood only when the path was clear, holding Caleb gently. The cameras outside grew brighter as he approached the door. The noise swelled, but inside his chest, only silence lived. He didn't offer a statement. He didn't need to, because the evidence had already spoken. The justice had already begun, and the moment was already immortal. The world had just witnessed hate meeting its mirror, and the reflection would not fade easily. Within hours of Flight 419's landing, the world ignited. The video hit the internet like a spark in dry brush. Someone, no one knew who, first posted a 37-second clip on multiple platforms. The caption read simply, "Passenger attacks father and baby mid-flight." Within minutes, it was being reposted, subtitled, and dissected. The footage opened with Cliff's raised voice, the swing of the seatbelt, and Isaiah's controlled but firm restraint. Caleb's faint crying played beneath the chaos like a haunting echo. News anchors debated it. Talk shows replayed it. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag Justice for Caleb. Hashtag Skyline Assault. Hashtag Isaiah stood still. In the quiet of his apartment, Isaiah Trent sat motionless. Caleb asleep against his chest, unaware of the storm outside. His phone buzzed non-stop. Messages poured in, some supportive, some furious. "Thank you for standing strong. You give people like me hope. This could have been me and my son." But amid the gratitude came venom, too. Racial slurs disguised as questions. Anonymous threats dripping with malice. He read each one silently, then deleted them, his fingers trembling only once. Across town, Malcolm Ford paced his office, a grim line between his brows. The seasoned attorney had seen public uproars before, but this one felt different, louder, more divided, more dangerous. He called Isaiah immediately. "Don't post anything." Don't respond to anyone, Malcolm said sharply, gripping his phone with one hand, flipping through news sites with the other. This is no longer just a legal case. It's a national flashpoint. Isaiah exhaled slowly. I didn't ask for any of this. I know, Malcolm said, his voice softening. But now that you're in it, we're going to handle it right. Outside the courtroom, however, public opinion took its own path. Cliff's lawyer, Bradford Kane, released a calculated press statement that same night. It aired on the evening news. My client, Mr. Cliff Mercer, deeply regrets the incident aboard Flight 419, but believes the footage has been unfairly interpreted through a lens of racial bias. We ask for patience while the facts are properly examined. Isaiah watched the clip silently on his laptop. The word bias repeated 3 times in under 60 seconds. He felt his jaw tighten. There had been no misinterpretation. Cliff had swung first. Cliff had shouted. Cliff had lashed out. The footage showed that. But now, lines were being blurred with clever wording and selective outrage. That same night, the airline, Heirloom Airways, released a 2-paragraph statement. It offered sincere apologies to the passengers affected by the unfortunate altercation, but made no mention of race, no recognition of Cliff's aggression, and certainly no mention of Isaiah or his infant son. The apology, Isaiah thought, was more like a patch on a sinking boat. Meanwhile, online, people took sides. Some demanded justice. Others accused Isaiah of provoking the situation. A few claimed the entire thing had been staged for attention. It wasn't just the video that had gone viral, it was the conversation, the confrontation, the conflict, the culture. Then something shifted. Noel Archer, a sharp-eyed investigative journalist known for peeling back corporate curtains, released a bombshell thread on social media late the next evening. Line by line, he laid out the truth. Cliff Mercer was not just a random passenger, he was a regional manager for Heirloom's parent company, Altaview Holdings. The thread included internal documents, LinkedIn screenshots, and a leaked memo indicating Cliff's direct involvement in corporate policy development. Isaiah read it twice before it sank in. So Cliff wasn't just a passenger who snapped. He was part of the machinery. The same company that issued the limp apology had employed him, and now it was trying to separate itself from him as quietly as possible. The implications were staggering. Cliff's position meant the airline had every reason to downplay the incident, and perhaps, Isaiah realized, every reason to shift blame. Malcolm's voice came through clearly when Isaiah called him at midnight. "This changes the game," Malcolm said. "If we can prove the company knew about Cliff's behavior beforehand, if we can show they tried to cover this up, we don't just have a lawsuit. We have a corporate reckoning." Isaiah leaned against the cold window pane, looking out into the night. "I just wanted to get home. That's all. And now," Malcolm replied, his tone slow and steady, "you might help a lot more people get there safely." But Isaiah wasn't thinking about lawsuits or headlines. He was thinking of Caleb's small fingers curled around his shirt that night in the cabin, the way he'd whispered to soothe him, the fire in Cliff's eyes, the silence that followed, and now, the roar. He turned back toward his sleeping son and gently pulled the blanket higher around him. The world outside could rage all it wanted. In that small living room, only one truth mattered. It had grown wings far larger than the flight that started it. He lashed a baby's tiny body with a seatbelt, leaving bruises across innocent skin. If you believe no parent should watch their child suffer in silence, hit subscribe now. Justice strikes back harder than hate ever could. The moment Gavin Lorne received the suspension notice, Isaiah knew the game had changed. It arrived quietly, without warning, an official email from Heirloom's HR department citing procedural violations during an in-flight disturbance. Gavin stared at the screen in disbelief, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of his kitchen counter. The language was cold, vague, and utterly punishing. It was not just a reprimand, it was exile. And for what? Trying to stop a man from whipping a child with a seatbelt? Isaiah read the message from Gavin on his phone while Caleb napped beside him. The words stung. "They're burying me, Isaiah. I tried to do the right thing, and now I'm the liability." Isaiah stared out the window, his mind sharpening into a blade. Cliff Mercer's attack had been only the surface. Beneath it lay something far more calculated, far more dangerous. A corporate culture built on silence and survival. That evening, Isaiah met with Malcolm Ford in a quiet corner booth of a coffeehouse known for discretion, no cameras, no curious stares. The table between them was scattered with printed complaint forms, employee memos, and post-it notes filled with names. Malcolm tapped one of them, a list of ex-employees with non-disclosure agreements tied to prior incidents involving Cliff. "They've known about him for years," Malcolm said grimly, pushing a thick envelope forward. "Here. 5 documented complaints, all settled. Not one reached public record." Isaiah leaned back, absorbing the weight of it. "And the board? Complicit or blind?" "Take your pick," Malcolm replied. He wasn't smiling. He didn't need to. The pieces were falling into place and the picture was ugly. Dramatic irony hung in the air like stale perfume when, days later, Aerolim's PR department announced a bold new Diversity and Equity Improvement Initiative. The press release was filled with optimistic jargon, cultural audits, listening forums, and employee-led reform panels. Yet in fine print, Cliff Mercer was still listed as under internal review, quietly drawing salary from the same company he'd publicly embarrassed. The media wasn't fooled, at least not all of it. Several outlets ran lukewarm stories praising Aerolim's commitment to progress, but one voice cut through the noise with surgical precision: Noel Archer. The investigative journalist had been quietly following Isaiah's case from the moment the footage broke. Now, he delivered a bombshell article exposing the airline's pattern of shielding problematic employees while punishing whistleblowers. The article quoted anonymous former staff members, each echoing the same chilling pattern: harassment minimized, racism reframed as interpersonal conflict, and disciplinary action reserved not for aggressors, but for those who dared to speak out. Isaiah stared at the article, feeling both validation and sorrow. He scrolled slowly through the comments, thousands of voices rising in solidarity, and just as many spewing doubt, mockery, or hate. "Don't let the noise shake you," Malcolm said the next morning as they stood in front of a corkboard now pinned with over a dozen ex-employee testimonies. One of them was especially significant. Gavin had agreed to testify. Isaiah met him in a shaded parking lot near the courthouse. The younger man looked worn but resolute. His uniform was gone, replaced by jeans and a plain button-down shirt, but his back was straighter than before. "I've never spoken out against a company in my life," Gavin admitted, voice low. "But if I stay silent, they win. And maybe next time, that baby gets hurt worse, or someone else does." Isaiah nodded. "You did the right thing. Now let's make sure it counts." The meeting marked a turning point. Malcolm quickly filed paperwork to add Gavin as a witness. Meanwhile, Noel Archer connected them with 2 former Heirloom ground staffers who had filed racial discrimination claims years earlier, claims that vanished after settlements and NDAs. One of them, a baggage handler named Tyler Voss, agreed to provide a written affidavit detailing internal warnings about Cliff Mercer being volatile under pressure and reactive toward minority passengers. The walls were beginning to close in, but so were the stakes. Heirloom's legal team responded with sharp deflection. They released a new statement denying Gavin's suspension was retaliatory. "Safety procedures must be followed regardless of personal intent," it read. It was a neat excuse for punishing integrity. Meanwhile, Isaiah's inbox filled with mixed messages, support from strangers, but also legal threats hinting at defamation if he pursued action against the company. One night, as he paced his apartment, Isaiah stopped at the window and looked up at the same sky his flight had once pierced. Caleb stirred in his crib behind him. There was a time he would have taken this as a signal to stop, to protect what little calm he had left. But not anymore. He turned to Malcolm the next morning with a single sentence. "Let's subpoena the settlements." Malcolm smiled tightly. "It'll get ugly." "I'm not afraid of ugly," Isaiah replied. "I'm afraid of silence." With Gavin now firmly part of their team and a new batch of damning documents under review, Isaiah felt the storm shift. Eralim's silence was cracking, and what poured through wasn't just truth, it was accountability in motion. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even just about Caleb anymore. It was about clearing the sky for everyone who had ever been forced to fly through storms they didn't cause. As they reviewed testimony drafts late into the night, Malcolm raised his head and said, "You ready for what's coming?" Isaiah nodded once. Justice wasn't a destination. It was turbulence one had to ride through to reach clear skies. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Isaiah Trent took the stand. The murmur of reporters still lingered faintly behind the thick oak doors, their voices muffled, but their presence undeniable. The judge, a stern-faced man named Harold Beck, nodded toward Isaiah, signaling the start of testimony. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but the air carried the weight of a million unseen eyes watching through headlines and live updates. Isaiah adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal blazer, took a breath that steadied the tremble in his chest, and began. "I boarded Flight 419 with my infant son, Caleb," Isaiah said, his voice calm but threaded with tightly leashed emotion. "We were seated in first class." The tension began shortly after takeoff. It escalated quickly. And then, "He struck me with a seatbelt." He paused, his throat tightening. His eyes dropped for a moment, reliving the moment, the sting across his arm, the gasp from the passengers, the sound of Caleb's frightened wail. "I did what I had to do to protect my son." Malcolm Ford, his attorney, stood just behind the defense table, hands clasped tightly, eyes never leaving the jury. Isaiah's testimony was simple, direct, but each word landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the room. The jury, 6 men and 6 women, watched him intently. No one scribbled notes. They just listened. When Isaiah reached the part where Cliff had screamed, "People like you don't belong here," the air in the courtroom changed. Even the court reporter looked up from her keys. Isaiah didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize, but his restraint made the moment land even harder. Next came Gavin Lorne. The former flight attendant's hands shook slightly as he took the stand, but his voice, once uncertain, gained strength with each word. "I witnessed the entire incident. Mr. Mercer escalated the situation. He was aggressive from the beginning. Isaiah, Mr. Trent, never raised his voice, never made threats. He only reacted when his son was endangered." Gavin turned toward the jury. "I tried to step in, I really did, but by the time I reached them, Cliff had already swung the belt." There was a moment of silence after his statement. Judge Beck adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly forward, as if weighing the words for hidden weight. The defense team looked visibly agitated. Then it was the defense's turn. Cliff's attorney, Douglas Raines, a tall man with slicked-back silver hair, rose from his seat with the confidence of someone used to commanding rooms. He approached the jury slowly, holding a printed still frame from the incident, a blurry moment where Isaiah's arm appeared raised, the belt taut in his grip. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are not here to deny that a confrontation took place," he began smoothly. "But we must ask, was Mr. Trent's reaction proportionate? Did he use excessive force in response to a verbal provocation?" He wrapped a seatbelt around my client's face. A few members of the jury shifted uncomfortably. Raines seized the moment. "My client regrets raising his voice, but being hit in the face with a belt." He let the question hang. "That's not self-defense. That's retaliation," Malcolm rose. Objection. Mischaracterization. Sustained, Judge Beck replied without hesitation. Malcolm stepped forward, calm, precise. With the court's permission, I'd like to present additional footage recently obtained from another passenger seated on the opposite aisle. Judge Beck nodded. A screen was rolled in, and the room dimmed slightly as the video began to play. The angle was different. It showed Cliff's hand clearly, his grip tightening around the belt, his sudden rise, and the unmistakable arc of leather as he swung, unprovoked. The metal buckle caught the light before it struck Isaiah's arm. Gasps echoed. Even Cliff's attorney looked momentarily stunned. But Malcolm wasn't finished. "Now, Your Honor," he said, his voice firm, "I also submit into evidence a series of internal emails leaked to us by a journalist from Arrogance executives." He handed the bailiff a folder, who then passed it to the judge. These emails, dated one day after the incident, instruct PR personnel to contain the racial narrative and to frame the situation as a passenger dispute. Not an assault, not an act of racial hostility, just a dispute. Judge Beck skimmed the first few lines. His eyes narrowed. One juror leaned forward in his seat. Another exhaled loudly, folding his arms. Malcolm turned to the jury, his voice quieter now. Isaiah Trent did not retaliate. He did what any father would do, what any human would do, when protecting a child. The real question is, how far was Arrogance willing to go to cover up the truth? A long silence followed. The judge finally looked up and announced a brief recess. The courtroom slowly emptied, but the buzz had returned. Low murmurs, wide eyes, text messages sent in hurried bursts. In the hallway, reporters circled like sharks. Isaiah sat back, his hand gently resting on the small silver toy truck Caleb had given him that morning for luck. His mind swirled not with anger, but clarity. This wasn't just about him anymore. It hadn't been for a while. Inside the now quiet courtroom, the projector screen still displayed a paused frame from the video. Cliff's hand mid-swing, fury on his face, Isaiah bracing with his son in his arms. Truth, once released, doesn't ask for permission to fly. The gavel struck once, firm, final. A hush fell over the courtroom as the foreman stood, clutching the verdict paper with trembling hands. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Heirloom Airways, guilty on all counts, negligence, misconduct, and perpetuating a pattern of racial hostility." The judge nodded solemnly, his expression betraying the weight of what had just been declared. Isaiah Trent sat frozen for a heartbeat, his breath caught in his chest. Across the room, Cliff Mercer's face drained of color, his posture stiff with disbelief. Cameras flashed like lightning in a storm outside the courtroom, but inside, time seemed to slow. The news traveled fast. Cliff was fired from his executive role within hours. Heirloom's PR team released a sterile statement, words carefully curated to limit liability but void of remorse. Yet the public wasn't fooled. News anchors ran segment after segment on the case, social media buzzed with headlines, and legal analysts called it a landmark decision. For Isaiah, however, the ruling was not an ending. It was a door cracking open. 3 days after the verdict, Malcolm Ford sat across from Isaiah in a quiet office above a small cafe in downtown Valenport. The lights were low, rain tapped softly against the window, and the weight of the past few weeks clung to the air. "We found something," Malcolm said, sliding a flash drive across the table. Isaiah picked it up slowly. "What is it?" "Recordings," Malcolm replied, his voice low. "Phone calls." Between Cliff and Arrogance executives, Isaiah's eyes narrowed. "What kind of recordings?" "The kind that change everything." The private investigator Malcolm had quietly hired during the trial had uncovered a hidden folder on Cliff's company-issued laptop. The files were voice recordings, secretly captured phone calls between Cliff and high-ranking Arrogance officials. Their content was damning. In one, a senior executive ordered Cliff to cooperate in creating a narrative that painted Isaiah as the aggressor. Another call detailed instructions to manipulate raw footage from the flight, cropping context and cutting reactions to make Isaiah's defensive action appear violent. The plan was meticulous, sinister in its design, and rooted not just in saving face, but in preserving an internal culture that had long turned a blind eye to abuse. Isaiah listened to the files in silence, his face unreadable. The voices played out like a slow-motion betrayal, each word confirming what his instincts had warned him from the start. Cliff wasn't just a violent man, he was a weapon wielded by a corrupt system. These are enough to open a federal case, Malcolm said. Tampering with evidence, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit defamation. Isaiah leaned back, Caleb asleep in a carrier beside him, his small chest rising and falling against Isaiah's side. He ran a hand over his face. "They were never going to stop at just humiliating me," he murmured. "They wanted to erase the truth." Malcolm nodded. "But now, the truth is louder." The recordings were submitted to the U.S. Attorney's Office, sparking immediate interest. A formal investigation was launched within a week. Aerolum's corporate headquarters in Eldwick were raided by federal agents, laptops seized, executives subpoenaed. The stock market responded swiftly. Aerolum's value plummeted overnight. Shareholders demanded answers. Board members scrambled to distance themselves. Within 2 weeks, the company's CEO, COO, and legal advisor all resigned in disgrace. But Isaiah didn't speak to the press. He didn't schedule interviews or bask in the public spotlight. He stayed home, rocking Caleb under soft lamplight, returning to routines made sacred by their quiet simplicity. The same hands that had once protected his son midair now made oatmeal in the morning and flipped picture books at night. The world called him a hero. To Isaiah, he was still just a father who'd wanted a peaceful flight. One afternoon, as he and Malcolm stood outside the courthouse after giving depositions for the federal case, Malcolm turned to him. "You know, you could sue again. For defamation, for emotional distress. You'd win." Isaiah considered it for a moment. "Maybe," he said, "but that's not the battle I want to fight now." "What is?" Malcolm asked. Isaiah looked up at the clear sky overhead, planes cutting clean trails across it. His voice was quiet, certain, rebuilding, starting over, making sure no one else ever has to prove their dignity midair. A soft breeze stirred, carrying with it the sounds of a city in motion, but Isaiah heard only the rhythm of his son's breathing. The storm that had begun with a seatbelt and a shout had become something larger, a reckoning, a call for change, a fire that refused to be buried beneath PR scripts and courtroom tricks. And yet Isaiah didn't stand on podiums or shout from rooftops. He returned home. He held Caleb close. He whispered to him not about victory, but about peace. The night the news broke of the federal case widening, of new indictments, and of the airline's fall from grace, Isaiah sat on his balcony, a warm blanket over Caleb's small body. He didn't look at the screen or the headlines. He looked at the stars. The sky that once witnessed violence now carried the quiet hum of justice. Isaiah's hand hovered for a second above the light switch, the soft hum of the baby monitor beside him filling the quiet hallway. He had just laid Caleb down, the toddler's breathing slow and steady beneath a light blanket stitched with tiny stars. Yet, even as peace blanketed his home, Isaiah's mind remained unrested. He blinked, and for a split second, the bedroom ceiling transformed into the curved cabin of Flight 419, the belt slicing the air, the panic, the glare in Cliff's eyes. A phantom sound, just a whisper of memory, made him flinch before he exhaled and flicked the hallway light off. Months had passed since the courtroom doors had closed behind him. The trial was over, the verdict delivered, but life afterward had taken a strange, unpredictable shape. Where once he moved through airports invisible, now people stopped him mid-step, some with reverence, some with gratitude, others simply curious. A barista wrote, "Thank you," on his coffee cup in block letters. A construction worker in a neon vest nodded wordlessly as he passed. Isaiah appreciated the kindness, but every new gesture also deepened the awareness that his quiet life had become a symbol he never asked to carry. He sat now at the edge of his bed, the room dim except for the soft blue glow of a night lamp. His laptop lay open beside him, half a document drafted, half a blank page staring back. Treneth Systems, the software company he'd built over years of steady, careful work, had weathered the storm during the trial thanks to a loyal team. His partners had shielded operations, reassured clients, and preserved the company's values when he couldn't be there. Returning to work should have been a homecoming, but instead, it felt like stepping into a new role in an old costume. People spoke to him differently now, not just as the founder, but as the man from the flight. He tried not to resent it. He understood that public memory latched onto heroes, onto narratives of strength and resilience. But Isaiah didn't feel strong. Not when he lay awake at 2 a.m., the silence pierced by remembered cries. Not when he hesitated to board a plane for a client meeting, fingers tightening around Caleb's stroller like it might shield them both. He hadn't asked to become an emblem. All he wanted was dignity, safety, for himself, for his son. But somehow, that quiet need had turned into a public cause. It was Malcolm who first alerted him to the ripple effect. "They've reopened the whistleblower files," Malcolm said one morning, his voice low over the phone. "Over 30 former employees came forward after your testimony. Cases that were buried years ago, some of them go back a decade." Isaiah closed his eyes, leaning against the kitchen counter as sunlight streamed through the blinds. "And they're finally being heard?" "They are now." "Your case set a precedent," Malcolm replied. "Legal schools are even using it in ethics modules. They're calling it the Trent threshold." Isaiah had no words for that. He never wanted a nameplate on reform. But if his pain had shifted something, made someone else safer, more visible, more heard, perhaps it had purpose. Even so, the weight didn't lift easily. One afternoon, while picking Caleb up from daycare, he overheard 2 men near the reception desk whispering his name. "That's him, right? The guy from that flight?" Isaiah kept his expression neutral, offering a polite nod as he passed. But inside, a familiar unease returned. He didn't want Caleb to grow up under a shadow of public scrutiny. He didn't want the boy's earliest memories to include people pointing, whispering, staring. He wanted bedtime stories, not news headlines. That night, as the wind rattled faintly outside their apartment window, Isaiah sat in his home office with a cup of herbal tea cooling in his hands. On his screen was a draft, an open invitation from a civil rights foundation to speak at a conference. The message was respectful, the platform huge, but Isaiah hesitated. He reread the email twice, then minimized it. Instead, he opened a document labeled Treneth Core Values. He began rewriting the training protocol, this time, including a section on internal culture, unconscious bias, and employee dignity. He wouldn't speak on stages, but he could make sure that his company reflected what he fought for. If change had to start somewhere, it might as well begin with the systems he could control. Later that week, Malcolm forwarded him an article. Heirloom's whistleblower division had officially launched a new investigation unit. Cases that had once died in silence were being brought back to life. Employees like Ramon Yates and Devin Marks, who had endured silent discrimination under managers like Cliff Mercer, were now getting legal representation and compensation. Isaiah scrolled through the article, pausing when he saw his own face in the header. He looked away quickly. He didn't want to see what the world saw in him. He only wanted Caleb to sleep peacefully and grow up in a world that didn't punish quiet strength. The knock on his door that evening was unexpected. A delivery man, college-aged, stood with a manila envelope. "This came for you," the boy said, glancing at Isaiah with wide eyes. "Thanks for what you did, sir." Isaiah accepted the envelope with a nod. Inside, folded carefully, was a letter from a legal intern at Airolum who had watched the trial from the gallery. The message was handwritten. "I grew up thinking silence kept us safe. Watching you taught me that silence can also be a cage. Thank you for helping me walk out of it." Isaiah stared at the note for a long time, emotion heavy in his chest. He didn't know the writer, might never meet him, but the impact, unmeasurable, was real. That night, after brushing Caleb's hair from his forehead and dimming the lights, Isaiah sat beside the crib. Caleb stirred, eyes half-lidded with sleep. Isaiah reached out, resting a hand gently on the small back rising and falling with breath. He whispered, voice barely audible above the gentle murmur of the baby monitor. "Sometimes the storm doesn't end. It just teaches you how to walk through rain." Isaiah Trent stood silently just beyond the security gate at Terminal C of Leontide International, his eyes fixed on the glass windows that overlooked the tarmac. Sunlight reflected sharply off the wings of a departing Aerolum jet, the silver body gliding into blue, clean and polished like the company's branding, sleek, confident, and, until recently, unexamined. The irony wasn't lost on him. This terminal, once a scene of humiliation and restraint, was now a meeting ground for something far more complex. He adjusted the cuff of his slate-gray blazer with deliberate calm, masking the tension coursing beneath his skin. Behind him, a suited attendant cleared his throat. "Mr. Trent, they're ready for you now." Isaiah nodded, inhaled slowly, and turned. The boardroom was sterile, chrome accents, high-backed chairs, and framed aerial shots of Aerolum's fleet decorating the walls. At the head of the table sat the airline's new CEO, Raymond Greaves, a sharp-jawed man in his late 50s with thinning hair and an expression caught somewhere between apology and calculation. Flanking him were senior executives, compliance officers, and a young note-taker nervously tapping his pen against a legal pad. "Mr. Trent," Raymond began as Isaiah entered, "thank you for agreeing to meet." "We understand how difficult this must be." Isaiah sat without replying. The silence, shaped by years of restraint and recent fire, was its own kind of authority. "We've reviewed the findings of the federal investigation," Raymond continued, trying not to look too rehearsed. We failed, as a company, as a system, and we'd like your guidance in helping rebuild from that failure." Isaiah leaned back slightly, fingers steepled. "You don't want my guidance," he said plainly. "You want redemption, optics that say you listened." Raymond stiffened, the executives around the table shifting uneasily. But Isaiah wasn't finished. "I spent the last year trying to give my son a world where men like Cliff Mercer don't get to hide behind policy binders and scripted apologies. I watched that same system try to twist my silence into guilt. You want help now because your stock is plummeting and your shareholders are nervous, not because you suddenly found your conscience." Tension prickled the air like static. No one spoke. The note-taker's pen had stopped tapping. Raymond exhaled, then leaned forward, more genuine this time. "You're right," he admitted. "All of it. We do need redemption, but some of us, me included, believe it can't come unless we start by learning from the man we failed." Isaiah stared at him, weighing the words carefully. There was no satisfaction in watching them squirm. He hadn't come for that. He had declined their invitation twice already. But something had shifted after the last email, a quiet message from Malcolm that read, "Change only matters if someone like you is in the room when it happens." He thought of Caleb, thought of the buckle welts that had taken weeks to fade, and the memories that hadn't. Thought of Gavin Lorne, suspended for doing the right thing, and all the others who might never get their voices heard. Finally, Isaiah broke the silence. "I won't put my name on a statement. I won't be your public face, but if I'm in this room, every policy you draft, every training you implement, will be grounded in truth, not theater. You want change? Then let's talk about what that really costs." Raymond nodded slowly. That's all we can ask. For the next hour, Isaiah outlined the foundation for a new ethics framework. Mandatory bias training not just for staff, but for upper management. A third-party oversight committee with public reporting access, protections for whistleblowers, and a trauma support program for employees and passengers who experience discrimination. He spoke not from theory, but from lived experience, each sentence shaped by the price he had already paid. As the meeting drew to a close, Isaiah stood again at the window, the boardroom now quiet behind him. A fresh aerolum plane taxied toward the gate below, sunlight glinting off its nose. Malcolm's words echoed in his mind. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. It was about making sure no other father had to choose between restraint and justice, between dignity and silence. Raymond approached him quietly. "You didn't have to come today." "Thank you for choosing," to Isaiah didn't turn. His voice was low, steady. "I didn't choose this. It chose me. But what I do with it now, that's mine." The room emptied slowly after that. Outside, the wind shifted gently against the glass. Isaiah remained for a moment longer, his reflection faint in the window beside the rising plane. Then, with a small nod to no one in particular, he stepped away from the past toward something new. The same sky that once watched his suffering now carried his purpose. A year later, the world had moved on, but Isaiah Trent hadn't. The legal headlines had faded, the social media hashtags long since replaced by newer controversies. Aerolum had launched new training modules, new slogans, and a new CEO. But the images from that flight, Caleb's cries, the sting of the belt, the silence of passengers, remained vivid in Isaiah's mind like a permanent watermark. That day had changed his life, not just in how the world saw him, but in how he saw himself. It was a cold autumn afternoon when Isaiah stepped into the small, wood-paneled auditorium at Halberton Community Center. The lights were dimmed to a soft amber, casting gentle shadows across the modest crowd gathered for the memorial ceremony. The event, organized by a coalition of advocacy groups for victims of racial discrimination in travel, was intimate. No camera crews, no podiums adorned with logos. Just stories, just pain, and somehow healing. Isaiah stood quietly in the back row, cradling a folded program in his hand. On stage, a young man recounted a humiliating encounter from years prior where he was denied boarding because of a random check that was anything but random. Another spoke about being handcuffed on a tarmac due to a seat dispute that escalated only because of skin color. Each voice carried a shared weight, a wound Isaiah knew too well. Then a familiar voice echoed from the front. "My name is Gavin Lorne," the man said, standing behind the plain wooden lectern, his voice steady but humble. Isaiah looked up. Gavin was no longer in his flight attendant uniform. He wore a gray button-down, the sleeves neatly rolled. His posture was stronger, his eyes clearer than the last time Isaiah had seen him. "I was a flight attendant on Meridian Sky Flight 419, Gavin continued, "and I failed to stop what happened fast enough. I was suspended after trying to do the right thing. But today, I stand here not to talk about punishment, but about courage, the kind I saw in a father who protected his son with restraint when he had every reason to strike back. That man gave me the courage to speak up. I'm here because of him." His eyes met Isaiah's for a brief, unspoken moment. Isaiah nodded once, his expression unreadable but moved. Later that evening, as the ceremony ended and guests trickled out into the cooling dusk, Isaiah received a message on his phone. The sender's name made him freeze. Cliff Mercer. It had been almost 10 months since Cliff was sentenced for assault. He'd served 6 of those months in a low-security facility and completed a court-mandated counseling program. Isaiah hadn't expected to hear from him again, but the message was short, restrained, almost awkward in tone. "I know I have no right to ask, but I'd like to speak with you, in person. if you agree." The next afternoon, Isaiah found himself in a quiet corner room of a legal mediation center downtown. No press, no lawyers, no court clerks, just 2 chairs, a round table, a pitcher of water. The window overlooked a park with bare trees and gray skies, branches scratching gently against the wind like fingers seeking absolution. The door opened, and Cliff walked in. He looked smaller, though his frame was the same. His shoulders slumped slightly, and the sharpness in his eyes had been replaced by something more subdued, fatigue, maybe shame. He wore a beige coat, slightly too big, and carried nothing but a folded piece of paper that remained in his hand as he sat across from Isaiah. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence wasn't tense. It was thick with everything that had happened and everything that still didn't have words. Cliff finally broke it, voice hoarse. "I saw the footage again," he said, not looking up at first. "The full footage. From the other aisle. I hadn't seen it like that before. I saw myself, and I didn't recognize that man." Isaiah's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. He sat still, his hands resting in his lap, breathing slow. "I thought I was teaching you a lesson," Cliff continued, "but really, I was just showing my own fear. My own ignorance." His hands fidgeted with the paper he carried. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I wouldn't know what to do with it if you gave it. I wanted you to know I'm trying to understand who I was, and why I let myself become that." Isaiah studied him for a moment longer. The man in front of him was no longer the one who had screamed threats across an airplane aisle, but Isaiah knew well that apologies, however honest, didn't erase consequences. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "You wanted control," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I wanted peace." Cliff looked up slowly, his face tight, his jaw trembling. There were no defenses left in him. Isaiah stood, picking up his coat without haste. He paused at the window for a moment, staring at the wind tossing brittle leaves across the pavement below. Then he turned back to Cliff, his tone softened, not with sympathy, but with resolution. "Maybe we both learned what those words really mean." With that, Isaiah walked out, the door clicking shut behind him. Outside, the evening light poured through the tall windows, casting long amber streaks across the floor. It moved like warmth chasing away shadows, quiet, unannounced, but impossible to ignore. In a world that once punished his calm, Isaiah had learned that true strength was never in fury. It was in restraint that changed hearts. He scarred a child's skin with hate and met the same pain moments later. If you believe the strong must protect the innocent, subscribe now, because justice never stays seated. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, retaliation, and the devastating toll of violence when prejudice goes unchecked. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke empathy, and encourage reflection on how equality, respect, and compassion must prevail over hate.